I don't even have mine. Oh, wait. Look across.
All right, and if you're just coming in, we are live. We'll just wait for a critical mass of people to join us here in the Zoom room before we dive in. If you're already here, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. All right, so as folks continue to log in, welcome everyone. I'm Julia, a bookseller at Politics and Prose. We're live with Matthew Raiford, Amy Paige Condon, and Dr. Jessica B. Harris discussing Bress and Nyam, Gullah Geechee recipes from a sixth-generation farmer. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. If you want to enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. And before we dive in, we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are really grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce this exciting new book. From hot buttermilk biscuits and sweet potato pie to salmon cakes on pepper rice and gullah fish stew, Gullah Geechee food is an essential cuisine of American history. It is the culinary representation of the ocean, rivers, and rich fertile loam in and around the coastal South. From the Carolinas to Georgia and Florida, this is where descendants of enslaved Africans came together to make extraordinary food, speaking the African Creole language called Gullah Geechee. In this groundbreaking and beautiful cookbook, Matthew Raiford paid homage to his cuisine that nurtured his family for 7 generations. In 2010, Raiford's Nana handed over the deed to the family farm to him and his sister, and Raiford rose to the occasion, nurturing the farm that his great-great-great-grandfather, a freed slave, purchased in 1874. In this collection of heritage and updated recipes, he traces a history of community and family brought together by food. Matthew Raiford was named a 2018 James Beard Award semifinalist and has been featured in the New York Times, Southern Living, and more. And award-winning freelance writer Amy Paige Condon is the founder of the Refinery Writing Studio, where she teaches creative writing. She serves as an associate editor of Beacon, a quarterly magazine devoted to solutions journalism from the Savannah Morning News. She co-authored Bress and Nyam, Gullah Geechee recipes from a sixth-generation farmer. Please head over to our website to check over all of her amazing titles. And of course, with us this evening is the renowned Dr. Jessica B. Harris, considered by many to be one of the ranking authorities on the food of the African diaspora. She's the author, editor, or translator of 18 books, including 12 cookbooks documenting the foodways of the African diaspora. Harris consults internationally and conceptualized the award-winning cafeteria of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. She is currently leading the Culinary Institute of America's new African Diaspora Foodways Initiative and is the lead curator for the exhibit African American, Making the Nation's Table, to be presented by New York's Museum of Food and Drink in 2022. Among her numerous accolades, she is the 2020 James Beard Lifetime Achievement Awardee and has taught at Queens College, CUNY, New York for 5 decades. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Matthew Raiford, Amy Paige Condon, and Dr. Jessica B. Harris. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. It is such an honor to celebrate the launch of Matthew's cookbook, not just because of the joy of working on Matthew's debut cookbook, but also being in the presence of one of the people, one of the elders who made this book possible, truly, because you plowed through those troubled waters to really establish African foodways and African American cooking as the essential cornerstone of American cookery. You gave it the gravitas of scholarship and the soul of vivid storytelling. And so I'm just honored to be sitting with both of you today. I'm going to start, though, by going to the end of Bress and Nyam, where you write, Matthew, in the acknowledgments that throughout my life and career, I have been aided and uplifted by some extraordinary women. And the first woman you think, you thank in there is Auntie Jessica B. Harris, who, I quote, you said, made sure you always paid attention to the details. So Matthew, how did y'all meet and what kind of guidance has Dr. Harris given you throughout the years? And also, what details do you now pay attention to that you weren't or might have missed otherwise?
Well, for me, I think it has a lot to do with, if I go back to the Taste of Heritage dinner that was in Washington, D.C., and then play it forward to me landing at the Culinary Institute of America and getting my first Jessica B. Harris cookbook, the Africa Cookbook, Taste of a Continent, my path to find that information or to find someone that was talking about it all came full circle for me. So being able to be around people that talked about it and then were like, oh, and this came from here, and oh, this was cooked like this. Like I used to always talk to people about how food is grown and how we did things here, and people just look at me like, I don't know about that. I've never heard anybody doing that. And then I was like, nah, I mean, that I grew up seining and fishing like that. I grew up casting. I grew up hunting as just part of like a regular conversation. And when I started into the Africa Cookbook, which is this one, I still have it all the way from back when. And what's funny is I actually have walked around with it for many years, just like this, because I never wanted the cover to get messed up. It was something about this cookbook that I was sitting back going, nobody has written this. Nobody has talked about this. And so I was like, if I ever find somebody, and then I also had been shamed into thinking that Southern cuisine was like the lowest of the low style of cooking. But then going through the book, I was like, wait a second, folks in Africa have been cooking like this for how many years? And so having that conversation with myself over the years has kind of, guided me. But then I was at a dinner and Auntie Jessica and I ended up being at the same dinner at the same table. And I was telling her that I had wanted to write a cookbook. And her exact words to me were, if you write it, make sure you pay attention to the details. And when she said it in my head, I was like, attention to the details. Like, doesn't everybody do that? And she kind of looked at me with that look like, you do know that there are a lot of people that just put stuff out there and everybody just believes it. And so right off the rip, I felt that if I was going to write this book, that the details, the devils in the details actually was needed to happen. So for me, it was like from the very beginning. So I actually went back to the Africa Cookbook, Taste of a Continent, to see how it was written. And I used it as kind of my thought process as I was writing and putting things down. And I started to realize, like, behind me right now is like chickpeas and all of this stuff and coriander and couscous, like all these things are right behind me. And they've always been there. They've always been part of what I have cooked and done. And I'd have people be like, well, tell me what your style of cooking is. And I'd be like, well, it's more like Africa, but because most people don't understand that, I'd have to say Southern, and then people wouldn't really understand that. It's kind of like being in school and having Chef Papini say to me, Mr. Raiford, did you hear what I said? And I was like, oh yeah, Chef, you were talking about the macaroni and cheese sauce. And he was like, no, I was talking about a Mornay. And I said, yeah, that's a macaroni and cheese sauce. It's cream and cheese. And folks looking at me like, oh my God, this dude is like slap crazy. But I grew up making these things, not realizing they were just part of me and that I knew these things. It was kind of like, I can't take anything away from having went to school for culinary, but there was a lot in my first year that I learned that was already part of what I was doing every single day. So I think like the devil in the details kind of like really played out for me in paying attention to that.
Well, Dr. Harris, you had tremendous mentors. and you've turned around and become a mentor, and you had mentors like you wrote about in your memoir, Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. How did their guidance sort of prepare you to be this person who in turn became such a mentor, not only to chefs, but to other writers, to historians, to anthropologists? I mean, your work is so broad and so encompassing. And people in all different fields gravitate to it and learn something from it. And to be somebody who has been able to, like listening to Matthew, who's carried this book around for years.
Gosh.
And it's meant something to him. And it gave him a piece of himself that he didn't know he was missing. Talk about like what they gave you and how you pass that along.
The interesting thing is, I don't know if back then we were quite as concerned about mentors per se. I think that is a more recent thing that people are, almost taught in school. Look for a mentor, find someone to guide you. Was not the teaching when I was in school. And I always have to disabuse people of the notion that, like I was best buddies with. I wasn't.
Right.
I was a friend of someone who was Baldwin's best friend. That meant that when I was in my 20s and Baldwin was probably in his 40s or 50s, I spent some time in his company. That's a very different thing from a mentor. But what happened was, as a result of spending time in the company of folks like that, I got to see how they were in the world and their ways of being in the world, and the ways that they dealt with how the world perceived them. And I mean, I think that that's something that I've gotten from them, if you will, was a sense of how to get through things, how to not get your head turned, first of all. You got to remain yourself, because if you get your head turned, the only person you're making a fool of is yourself, really. So that, I mean, I think that in some cases, the lesson was very much about observing more than receiving, as in a handing off kind of thing. It was more about watching and seeing them and seeing how they were in different circumstances, because people could be imperious and people could be gracious, and every step of the spectrum in between. So I hope that I've learned not so much the imperious end of it, but the gracious end of it.
Well, it sounds like Matthew benefited definitely from the graciousness.
Well, I remember the evening because I think we were both at a conference in Greensboro.
Yes, absolutely. We were.
So I do remember you with your red glasses and stuff.
Yes, ma'am.
We were at the table together, and it was just sort of casual conversation. It wasn't a deep embedded conversation of any sort. But I remember thinking, oh, interesting. And yeah, I can't say another, because at that point in time, I don't know that I knew that many, but young Black chef, interesting. And actually, that was not that long ago.
No, that meeting was less than 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It was probably more like maybe 8 years ago.
Yep, because I think that
I was back home already.
Yeah, but I met Jovan before I knew you.
Well, right.
And I knew her in Brooklyn because I remember her taking me out to dinner, and we sat and talked about all sorts of things. And I kept wondering, why is this? I kept waiting for her to say, I'd like, and would you, and could you? And she said, no, I just wanted to have you to dinner. It's like,
right.
Okay.
Yep.
But so we've been sort of circling around each other's orbits.
There you go. And I think the other time was at a slow food conference in New Orleans.
Yeah, now that goes back.
Right.
That goes back. That goes way back. Yeah.
There we go.
Because that would have been New Orleans before Katrina. So that was in the in the early in the earlies.
Mm-hmm. So it's been a while.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. I've got the barnacles on my bow to prove it.
Oh my goodness. Still young. Still young.
Dr. Harris, you just mentioned that when you were sitting there with Matthew that time, you were thinking, here's a young Black chef, and there weren't that many at that point. And when you began, your writing career, you were really breaking new ground in a way. And by speaking of the foodways of African diaspora, and now you've fostered an entire course at the Culinary Institute of America, a whole course load, and that's giving Black chefs a platform from which to share their stories and their expertise, but also broadening the appreciation of where food comes from and the road it's traveled and these techniques. Like Matthew talking about how these were techniques that were natural to him because that's what he grew up with, but they were maybe looked down upon or not as appreciated in sort of the French canon and that type of canon. And now you also have a Netflix series coming up that debuts next week with Whetstone Stephen Satterfield that's based on your book, High on the Hog. So there's this real convergence, this recognition of African-American contributions to food and drink happening. And you're definitely one of the guiding lights of that, but it's been a long time coming.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, like when it's been sort of 40 years of laying this groundwork. So what does it mean for you to witness chefs like Matthew stepping into their own and this deeper appreciation and understanding in ways that hasn't really been part of the conversation in this country?
Well, I mean, I think obviously it's extraordinarily gratifying to have people even say you were there, because I think what we're talking about what I've learned for what I did learn from those folks that we named. One of the things that I learned was do your work. Just plain do your work, and it becomes whatever it becomes. And if your work is meaningful, and hopefully all people's work is in some way or another, then do your work. And what falls out, what comes along, what happens as a result of it will then tell whatever it tells. But in the course of the doing of your work, always be open for folks, always be open to something. So I mean, I think for me, the thing it's gratifying and it's frightening because nobody is my vast age, I don't think. And the point is, the interesting thing about looking out as opposed to looking at is I don't feel like I'm this old. So when people are beginning to talk like venerable and these words, it's like, who they talking? Not me. I'm ready to go boogie. So,
Definitely.
it becomes an interesting thing. I mean, all of this reverence is not at all who I am or want to be. It's like I'm me.
Mhm.
I want to go play. I want to belong. I want to, have a drink with the guys and the gals hang out at the bar after the conference and act the way I've always acted. And this whole kind of pedestally, oh, that's so and so is like, nah. I was speaking with a friend in London earlier today, and we were talking, and she was like, well, just relax, just enjoy this. And it's like, enjoying it is good, but it's like, nah, I want to belong. I want to be a part of a crew. Now,
Mhm.
the lovely thing about Maya and Jimmy and Toni Morrison was a part of that group, as was Louise Merriweather and Rosa Gee and a lot of folks, Paul Marshall. They had each other. The nice thing about a lot of
Mhm.
you, Matthew, and other folks who are coming along right now is you've got each other. The interesting and somewhat scary thing about my place in wherever this is there wasn't a crew. A crew makes it easier to do. A crew makes it not necessarily easier to accomplish, but easier to get through because you've got folks to talk with,
Absolutely.
you know.
Absolutely.
Y'all just have to make me the old member in the crew.
Oh no, you are in there. Don't even worry about being. Age is nothing but a number within this case, for sure.
That's what my
Was it-
mother used to always say.
Was it Satchel Paige that said, "Age is mind over matter. If you don't mind, it don't matter"?
There you
There
go.
you go.
Well, I am
I'm
right
like-
there on that one.
I'm right there with that.
Perfect. I think that's
well,
a t-shirt.
But think about, I mean, the Netflix series is going to introduce you to a whole new group of people that happen to catch the show.
Well, only if they see the first episode. I'm only in the first episode.
Okay.
But I think you're absolutely right. There's nothing more to say. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
You might get a whole new crew out of this.
I might. But you never know. You never know. And my mother used to always say my mother was very sort of spiritual. She would say things like, I'm a divine work in progress and I'm still in progress. So I have no idea.
That part. There we go. That part.
No idea what is in progress, but I'm up for it, whatever it is.
Cool beans.
Matthew, I wanted to ask you, what would it have meant for you to have the program, the cuisines of Africa and the diasporas in the Americas when you were going through school?
But the program that's there now?
That's there now, yeah.
It's not there yet.
Or the one that's starting. Either way, it would have meant I probably would have stepped out there and wrote this very specific book along then, whenever, if it happened, and that was the 90s. But yeah, because I've always had that like straight sense of place, knowing where I grew up in the South, and knowing that, I was originally born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and lived between Bridgeport, Connecticut and Miami like every summer of my life until I was almost 18. So, and that was back when, summer was like 3 full months long almost. So I definitely probably would have written it a long time ago, but guess what? I also believe in that saying of everything has its time. And so now's the time for this book to come out. Now's the time for the African diaspora portion of CIA to come out. So I just believe everything has its time. And
total agreement with that.
Yeah, I just believe everything has its time. I think, I've heard consistently the saying where people are like, man, you're so far ahead of your time. And I've always been like, no, I'm not. I'm right in the time I'm supposed to be in. Like, I can't be ahead of it because that means I would be futuristic, right? So I'm always like, I'm right where I'm supposed to be, and if it doesn't work, then it just doesn't work. It's not that I'm so far ahead of my time. It's just my thought process was what it was supposed to be at that moment.
No, but I think equally that some of the ways in which you learn, that whole explanation that you gave earlier of a Mornay sauce.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like, yeah, that is a mac and cheese sauce. My mother's was a bechamel,
Right.
Mm-hmm. We grow up knowing these things. We grow up doing these things. I think one of the things with so-called soul food is that people tend to think of it as in, sort of very monolithic, monoculture. It is only this, it is only that, it is comprised of X, Y, and Z, but people don't think about the proximity to the land, which certainly Bress Nyam is reminding folks of. They don't think of various culinary skills that we had, various skills of animal husbandry and everything from chickens and raising chickens all the way through to how to set a table. I mean, even though it was not necessarily our home culture, it was something that we learned and then something at which we excelled. So that, you know, even if you weren't perhaps sitting at the table, you knew how to set a table. You knew how to go into a room and see, you know, raise one eyebrow and know this was right. Those people don't have that right. They're wrong on that. You know, because people have spent so much time with so many, for want of a better way of putting it, proximate lives. We have lived next to folks, and living next to people, if you are in positions where you are forced to observe them, you learn about them. So we have learned an awful lot. And all of that comes and shows up on our plates, at our tables, at home. And
Yes.
that's important.
Yes. I have to totally agree with that.
Matthew, you talk about in Bress and Nyam, there's a really particular moment that you'd always wanted to be a chef. And your father was against it because of his own experiences about really not being invited and appreciated for his expertise in as a pastry chef. And so would you read a little bit from pages 15 and 16, like from My Favorite Place Was Beside Nana, because that's, you and I talked a lot about that moment, how that was such a turning point for you, that it sent you off in a different direction. But then again, that different direction introduced you to all these different flavors out there in the world that you gravitated to naturally.
What do you want? What did you say you wanted me to start on page 15?
Maybe that My Favorite Place Was Beside Nana, to the moment you left the South.
Oh, wow. Okay. So my favorite place was beside Nana and my mother and aunts in the kitchen as their hands stirred Gullah fish stew, peeled shrimp for Creole, and spiced sweet potatoes for a pie. Even then, I wanted to be a chef, but my dad had other ideas. Back in Bridgeport, he'd worked in a bakery most of his adult life. He did not learn to read and write until he was 25 years old, but he could make the most delicate apple turnovers, tender crumbed cakes, and shattering pie crust you ever ate. Yet he had never seen someone who looked like me or him as the head of a kitchen. Even though he was a pastry expert, when he and my mother migrated back to Brunswick in the early 70s, he was denied jobs in bakeries. He was told flat out that he could not know more than his white bosses. And so he went to work as a boiler at the Lewis Crab Factory on Bay Street overlooking the East River. Then finally as a longshoreman at the port. A lot of things you can do, boy, but cooking ain't one of them, he said. And so I graduated from high school and took the only road out of Brunswick that I could find. I went into the military with a new wife and baby in tow.
So this speaks to, while it's a very singular story, it's also a story of a generation too, where there wasn't representation within kitchens and leading kitchens, but also this sense that you don't want to do that, go do something else, because I don't know, was there shame, or was there that's not good enough to be in a kitchen?
So go ahead.
You go. No.
I was just going to say, like, for my dad, at that very specific point in time, he was grappling with a lot of stuff when he came down to the South. Like, there were things that I think he thought he understood, but it was in a different, like, he had been raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So any racism that he had experienced was either overt, or he just knew that you don't go over here. Like, they live over there, we live over here kind of thing. And that's just the way it's always been. But then when he came to the South, it was a very like, nah, you better not ever, and being told that, like, with a point. And, and I think that, a lot of people don't know what a boiler is at the Lewis Crab Factory. So let me tell you what a boiler is. You are the person that literally boils the crabs in these big giant vats and pull the vats out, and then you put them in the coolers so that when the women came in the next morning they could pick the crab meat. So my dad went from being a pastry chef in the North to being a boilerman in the South. And so he already had a thing about the fact that he couldn't read or write before he was 25. And then he had this whole thing about the fact that, like, my dad had this photographic thing, like he could watch you do something, he's off to the races. And he still does all of the recipes and stuff like that when he does cook around the house, just like that, like off the top of his head. He just looks over and goes, duh, 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 puts, and he'll take a measuring cup out and all that kind of stuff, but it's not like he's consciously measuring, right? And so when he had never experienced any Black folks that looked like him, no Black chefs, my dad was very adamant. I remember in 2006, he said, son, if I knew then what I know now, I would have made you go to culinary school. I'd have made you go to culinary school. But because he had never seen it, he didn't even think. And I remember this was 1985 when I graduated from high school. I told my dad I wanted to go to the Culinary Institute of America. And my dad didn't think there were any Black people that had ever went there. So he didn't want me to go and have to deal with that thing, because he also knew I had already grew up here, you know what I'm saying? And that my fuse was about that big at that point by the time I was 18, when it started off quite long. So he was just like, son, there's a lot of things you can do. And one of the things that I think I didn't say in the book was I had a choice. I could have went to college. I could have definitely went to college. I had 4 years of computer programming in high school, which means that I knew all the old languages that people don't even think about right now.
Cobalt.
So, yeah. Cobalt, Fortran, RPG. Like, I had 4 years of computer programming in high school and was teaching at the junior college. So I'm like that nerdy, super nerdy kid that wanted to be a cook, you know, and eventually become a chef. And my dad was like, nah, you can go to college. There's so many things you can do. Cooking, you like, what are you going to, you can be a slave for the rest of your life, was my dad's like ultimate thing. And then, you know, after I've done some of the things that I've done, and just even the work that I've done, he's always come back like, you worked where? You was on a private island. What was you like? I would have never thought, you know.
Was he in some ways trying to shield you from a disappointment he thought you would experience like he did?
Definitely. He was definitely trying to shield me from that. Plus, he'd also seen that so really quickly, you know, at that point in time, the right to vote had already been in place for a few years, right? The right to be able to go to any school and being integrated was becoming like, was actually, the stamp was like coming down a little bit harder on it, right? And my dad was like, boy, there's so much stuff you could do now. Like, I had no choice. You got choices. Why would you want to do this? And I was like, that's what I love to do. You know, I loved being in a kid. My first job was at a Piggly Wiggly. You know what I'm saying? I'm working in a deli bakery in a grocery store, you know, like, dad, I want to do this, you know? And yeah, and even every now and then, even here at the farm, because my dad also, you know, my dad grew up in Bridgeport with his grandparents that farmed also. And so one of the conversations that we've even had out here when I came back home, he was like, so you want to leave being a chef where you're making really good money at the House of Representatives, you want to come home and farm? Why would you want to? I said, Daddy. And he was like, oh yeah, that's right. And I started laughing, right? And he was like, why are you laughing? I said, because you're thinking that you stopped me one time before and look where I've gone. I ain't gonna stop him again because I know he probably is gonna excel again. So I think it's, you know, all parents, anybody that's around someone that they want to see better for, they want to shield them. That's just an automatic, you know what I'm saying? But I just think that there was also the time period, because I was born in 67. So when you start talking about, you know, that was 65, 2 years prior, it was like, hey, everybody's supposed to be able to vote, you know what I'm saying? And then I also went to one of the first integrated elementary schools here in the Deep South, and that was in the 70s. So when
20
people,
years after.
right. So, you know, yeah, you gotta play with that thing a little bit.
But I think the other thing that happens is it is absolutely about time.
Mm-hmm.
Had you come along at a different time, your story is not that unusual.
No, it's not.
Patrick Clark's father
Hmm.
had been a chef and wanted Patrick Clark to be anything but.
But yeah, I remember that.
If you think about that, I mean, my mother was actually a trained dietitian and
Mm,
was a private dietitian for a household in which all she had to do was come up with the menu. She didn't even have to cook it.
mm,
Somebody else would have cooked it. That was how large the household was. But her friends, and this goes back to the 30s, were like, no, you cannot do that. It is too much like domestic service. So let's not
hmm,
forget history in this, because what happened is for many years, and this is Chef Joe Randall, who I'm sure you know.
Oh yeah, I do know Chef Joe.
Chef
Uncle Joe.
Uncle
Uncle Joe.
Joe always says the big divide was the point, and I'm not sure of the year, but you can call him and he will answer you, and he may even be on this, in which case, if you're in the chat, tell us. Um,
Hmm.
when the US government took cooking from being domestic work
Hmm.
and made it professional work,
Hmm.
up to that point, most kitchens were manned by African Americans. They weren't necessarily the head chefs, but they were definitely the chefs and in the kitchens. And then when it became professional, you know, they were shunted aside. And so the thing then became, no, I do not want my child doing this at all, any kind of way, one way or the other. But that was also the time at which chefs began to increasingly make money.
Hmm.
Once it became professional, they were accorded respect. That was when people started saying, my son, the chef, with equal awe to, my son, the doctor, the lawyer, the Indian chief. And so a lot of that is very much tied up at particular points in time. And that, I think, is part of what's fascinating about your story, is that you come right there at that point when, you really represent a generational shift
Hmm.
between what things were possible for parents and your parents' generation, and then what things may be possible now. Your parents' generation is probably my generation.
What I noticed both in your books, Dr. Harris, as well as in Matthew's, is there's this undercurrent of not simply overcoming or survival, but really one of endurance, but also this real celebration of the craft, the ingenuity, the know-how, to be cultivated and honored and celebrated. And I hear that language more often now when it comes to talking about, some of the conversations Matthew and I had when we were working on the book, where he goes, look, we were the experts. All through history, we were the experts in cultivation. We were the experts in irrigation. We were that's why we were brought here. And so having it's almost like a change in the language surrounding um, the West African influences into the Americas, that this, talking about it in ways that honor the work of people. Can y'all talk a little bit about, just sort of having, Matthew, you talk about coming back to the land and farming and the honor in that, and breaking the ground and regenerative agriculture, all of those things that have this long, beautiful history, but have been, we don't talk about it here that way.
Hmm. Yeah, you know, people think I just came back home and started farming, but that's not quite the full story. The story goes, I left the South and I ain't never, ever going back to the South. Ever, 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 ever. And my nana saying to me, boy, you better stop saying never. And then for years, once I became an adult, my nana would ask in phone calls that we would have with all the family, baby, what we gonna do with all this land? And I kept telling them, y'all should go back to farming because that's what y'all know how to do. I did that for almost 20 years, probably, just like constantly saying that exact same thing. And then all of a sudden I was like, we should farm it. Like, that's what we know how to do. And that's literally when my Nana gifted us land, was like, well, y'all better get to farming.
What made you
And,
say we that time?
you know, I think I was at a point in my life where, I think for lack of better terms, I already felt like I'd accomplished so much that going back to the South, I dare somebody to say something to me. And I think I felt like I needed enough of that behind me so that once I got there, you know, and once I came back home, if somebody was like, oh, where'd you learn that? And I'd be like, you do know I graduated from the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York, the first culinary school in the United States, built in 1946 for returning GIs from World War II. So it's like, oh, you know, oh, well, where'd you learn how to farm? Oh, I grew up on this farm, but I went to UC Santa Cruz to the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. I have a graduate certificate in ecological horticulture. I felt I needed to have those kinds of things and be able to spew that pedigree out to people.
But Nana put you in your place on that.
Oh my God. Auntie Jessica, I'm telling you. So my Nana, I never forget, you know, I'm back home, I'm sitting in there, and my Nana, like, I was walking outside from the schoolhouse because that's where I was living, and my Nana was like, baby, Matthew, come over here. And so I came over, she said, tell me about what all that stuff you learned at school. And I said, what you talking about, Nana? She said, you went out to California, right? And I said, yes, ma'am. She's like, tell me what you learned. And I said, well, I learned about organics. And so I started talking to her, and she was like, wait, baby, what is you talking about? And I said, organic farming. She was like, no, I thought you went for some chemical stuff. And I said, chemical stuff? She said, yeah, organic chemicals, you know, periodic table, you know, she's starting to talk to me now, right? Like, she stepped out of her, you know, being Nana and being all nice and sweet. She was like, so you went out to California to learn from some white people what I already done told you and I already done taught you? And I was like, yes. Because at that moment, I realized that I literally had within me all these things that my Nana had consistently been showing me since I was a kid. Like, I've always been out here in these fields. You know, my sister's running joke is like, yeah, you know, people be talking about like throwing watermelons. I'm standing up there going, nah, y'all ain't never threw no watermelons before, because my sister and I remember throwing watermelons out our field into trucks as kids, right? We remember picking peas and sitting on the porch of my great grandmother doing snap beans, and, you know, like, no, baby, hold it like this and peel it down like that, and everything will come out, right? So I remember doing that as a kid, and we're not talking like one big bowl. Like in the movies, that's a running joke for me too. That's just one big bowl for that one little moment. I'm talking like bushels of like getting them lady peas out of there and getting them in the bags real quick, throwing them into the boiling water. Like, I grew up doing that, right? So then it was like, well, shoot, I'm acting like I don't know how to do this. You know, so on one hand, I had this like fierce thing, like I know how to cook. This is where I come from, da da da. But on the other thing, I also had this thing, I guess, subliminally in the back of my head, like, I need to prove it by making sure I have enough education behind me so nobody has anything to say to me. And it wasn't until my Nana actually was like, baby, you already know how to do this. And I remember like the year before she passed in 2015, we had this really long conversation about what her and my great grandfather used to do and all this stuff, and what her, well, not my great grandfather, my great great grandfather used to do, and like walking through the woods to get blackberries and the southern huckleberries, and like I'm listening to all of this and I'm like, so I literally could have truthfully sat at the feet of my elders and got the information I needed, and I felt that for some reason, to be authentic, I needed to do something else. And so now, you know, I mean, for me, you know, and there's nothing against education. So anybody that's listening to this, I don't want you to think like I'm saying you ain't got to go to school. You can just go listen what your grandmama and them done said. That isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying that we should never take for granted the information that's right in front of us each and every day. And for a moment, I was taking that for granted, you know? And now I walk around here and matter of fact, my grandfather, my mother's father, was the black iceman. So he was the one person, he had a contract, and he used to go up to the ice house and get ice to go in the ice box for black folks. I just got his ice pick, his hooks, and the big clampers that pick up the big things of ice. My mom just like out of the blue just walks up to me. I'm out of her house and she goes, "Oh, I need you to take all this stuff to the house. It belonged to Pop Pop." And I was like, "Well, what is it?" And she opens the bag and I was like, "A ice pick?" And she was like, "Look at it." And I pick it up and it's got the old Coca-Cola logo on it or whatever, like the old one. Like the one that they're using now, probably, because you know everybody trying to reinvent by going back to the back in the day. But that so I have all these tools that he used to have. You know, I still have old rolling pins still that I keep finding stuff. Every time I clean out something here, I find something else that is either culinary related or agricultural related or even building related. I just found a trowel the other day that I asked my mom, I was like, "When did they make handles like that?" She said, "Oh, that's your great granddaddy Harvest. I remember when he built this right here." So we walk over to the old house and she shows me the cement that was laid in front of that house and that was the trowel and that's why I found it. So it's like we really have to take time to just believe that there is something greater than ourselves.
Well, also to learn to accept legacy.
Yes.
You know, the
Mm-hmm.
legacy was there. You just hadn't accepted
I
it.
just hadn't accepted it. Right. Definitely. I'm in the South. I should be okay, but no.
Well, you bring out something I loved, and I'll say something that was such a gift for me in working on this book was I wasn't raised necessarily in a culture where the you could go back to the ancestors for answers. You know, you're supposed to get over grief and you're supposed to, you know, move on. But I remember us standing at Igbo Landing.
Yeah.
And you took the beads off your wrist and threw them out into the water.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the people who have been enslaved and brought over here actually made the choice to walk back into the water and drown.
Mm-hmm.
And so this will be my final question, then we're going to turn it over to, we've got quite a few questions from the audience that's out there. There's this looking to the ancestors for your answers, and you're talking about that in a way with Nana. Dr. Harris, you first, how did the ancestors speak to you? And then Matthew, how have they been guiding you, and how has this book actually affected your family?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I've always been a spiritual person. I have, you know, I talk to ancestors. You know, something is lost, I find it, I look up and say thank you. I do all kinds of strange things. I am initiated in an Afro-Brazilian religion, so I really talk to ancestors. And that has always just seemed absolutely natural to me. I see spirits. I do all kinds of strange things that folks would be surprised by. But I think the important thing is whether or not you see them, whether or not you know them, whether or not you are even comfortable with them. The point is that you acknowledge them, because without them, you wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most important connection of all, is, you know, those backs, those folks, those humans, those ancestors, those relatives are all links in the chain, of which you are simply the next link, neither the first nor the last, just the next.
Beautiful. Matthew.
Well, for me, if anybody looks at the picture on the front of the book, My nana used to say that was a big ass oak tree when I was a baby.
Here, I'll hold it up.
I mean, that oak tree right there was that big when she was a baby, and she passed at 96. And I still go out to that tree and kind of like give it my problems, right? If there's something I gotta get off my chest or say, I take it right to that. I still take it to that tree. And it's really interesting because, when you see I always joke that when people see stuff in the movies, like the candle flickers when you say something, or the wind blows and the Spanish moth moves a specific kind of way. I grew up knowing that. I grew up with my nana used to call us when we were kids. When she lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, she would call my mom and be like, "Put that boy on the phone." And I get on the phone and said, "What you dreaming about last night?" And I was like, "Huh?" And she said, "What you dreaming about last night?" And I was like, "Superman." And she was like, "Oh, you thinking about Superman?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She was like, "Okay." And then she'd get off the phone. And then I get a little letter in the mail that had a couple of dollars in it. And for the life of me, it wasn't until I was adult that I actually said, "Nana, what was them letters, the money you used to send me?" She said, "Oh, baby, that's how I played them numbers. I would call y'all and ask y'all what y'all dreamed about, and I played the numbers, and I would hit." And so I was always raised around that kind of spirituality, besides like just going to church. So I had that. I grew up with that. I grew up with walking through the house going, "Somebody smoking a cigar?" And my nana go, "No, that's Mr. James." I'm like, "Mr. James been dead like 5 years. What you mean?" Wait, I don't understand. And so I grew up also like feeling that. And then, I've always been very in tune to that kind of stuff. My sister even more so than me, but I've always been very in tune that there's something greater than Matthew. And every now and then Matthew needs to realize that not only is it greater than him, but it'll guide him along the way. And so I've done that, and I've taken that up as part of what I believe in and what I do spiritually, to ensure that that's the direction I need to go. And so far as how the book affects my family, like I have family members right now that are like, "Dude, like you did Brookman proud," because it's called Brookman Unincorporated is what this area out here that I live in. And I'm like, "What you talking about, cuzzo?" And they're like, "Dude, like you put in them stories like about us running through the woods and all that kind of stuff as a kid. Like, I don't think nobody would ever really wrote that." And I was like, "Why not?" I was like, "People been writing about that stuff all their life." I said, "Huck Finn ain't," I said, "Remember we used to joke when we were kids that Huckleberry Finn was not special. Like we grew up running up and down the Satilla River. We grew up jumping on logs and seeing how far we could go down and knowing how to swim and fishing with just a piece of cane. Like we know all of that kind of stuff." So yeah, I think so far as my family goes, they're extremely proud. They're happy. And it's funny because somebody asked me the other day, how come I can't speak Gullah Geechee so very well? And I explained to them that in our house, you were only allowed to speak the Queen's English. And if you spoke anything else, you had to be very careful. And so we learned to only speak the Queen's English. And if anybody looks at my name is Matthew Raiford. So until I walk through a door, you have no idea that I am who I am, that I look like this, you just presume that I'm a white guy about to walk through the door. And then when I walk through the door, I always know what people are thinking. And my dad always says, that's what I want you to be conscious of. Is when I walk through the door and somebody realizes they've never seen me before, they don't know anything about it, and I walk through the door and they kind of like eyebrow lift, or they're like, "Oh," or I walk up to the desk and go, "I'm here to see," and they're like, "Who are you here to see?" And I say, and they're like, "And you are?" And I was like, "I'm the 10 o'clock appointment." Sometimes I mess with people. "Oh, I'm the 10 o'clock appointment." The 10 o'clock appointment, they look down, they look back up at me. I said, "Yeah, right there, Matthew Raiford." And they're like, so I've always, so that's one of the reasons that I also felt that this book needed to be written also, was because, it was one of those things of like, the things that people thought were not the deal are actually the real deal. We should walk around and be proud of every single thing, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, and be unapologetic about it at this point. You know, it's funny. Somebody said, "Oh, dude, you acting like that because you in your 50s," and I was like, "Nah, not quite. Like I've been like this. I just didn't know how to express it completely without being completely in the negative. So this is me expressing me in a positive."
Okay, I'm gonna grab some questions from the attendees. Okay. So this one, and I'm not sure who this is directed to, so both of you can definitely answer this. What do you cook when you don't feel like cooking?
Huh?
I don't cook. If I don't feel like cooking, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, boom, hands down. If I don't feel like cooking,
Cereal.
Like, you know, that's me.
Yeah, I'm pretty much leftover noodles or noodles, chicken broth, and make some kind of chicken soup, and then put, you know, avocado and lemon juice. I mean, I do that with the sort of Latinx kind of chicken soup, and then sometimes I'll shove some, you know, Thai chili, sweet chili paste or stuff in there, and that'll make it sort of Asian chicken soup. But that's the go-to.
Okay. Actually, that sounds pretty good, and I may do that tonight.
I may too.
Okay, so Chef Raiford, who and what are your non-family sources of inspiration?
Well, one's right here on the screen with me. Dr. Jessica Harris would be one. When I think about non-family, it would have to be non-Black. I think that would have to be the conversation, because I feel so very interconnected with so many different Black people on so many different levels, to where I would have to think about what the people are that are not Black that have influenced my life. So that would be Dr. Dave, well, not doctor, but David Ivy Soto, who is a chef. He was he's my mentor. He was also my teacher at one point in time for culinary. And I remember when I graduated from CIA, he looked at me. He was like, "We are always going to be on the same level. I told you that before you went to school. I'm telling you, we're on the same level." And so he has been, and then another good friend of mine that's also I mentioned in the book is Vincent Natras. He is on Whidbey Island at Orchard Kitchen. And from the first time we met over a decade ago, our conversation has always been about how we're alike more than we're different. And so we both grew up in this very not quite po, that's P-O, no O-R. We grew up poor. So we weren't at the point that we ain't have nothing and was hoping we get something, but we didn't have enough of whatever it was that we did have. So we ended up, we've been able to, garner a really good friendship off the fact that we both come from that exact same background. And as we talk and over the last decade, we've actually found out that we are more alike than we are different. So those would be the two that I would say.
Was there one particular recipe that you felt was absolutely and especially important to include in the book? And if so, why? Okay,
so we were talking in the green room earlier, and Auntie Jessica was like, "Don't give it all away right now," And so I'll give it to everybody. So it would be the blackberry doobie that my great grandmother used to do, Grandma Florine, because it's blackberry season right now here on the farm. It would be the sweet potato pie that my Nana used to make. It would be my mom's Effie's molasses pound cake. And then last but not least, it would be my dad's apple turnovers. Now, I know everybody's like, "Man, that was like mostly sweet stuff." And I really don't
Nothing wrong with that.
I know, it's nothing wrong with that. But what's funny is I don't really eat a lot of sweets. So when I did, those would kind of be like the things. And then I guess lastly would be the Jello pie, because when I was in the military, whenever I'd come home, which wasn't quite often, but whenever I come home, my Aunt Mary Lou would make Jello pie for me. And it's super simple. We're talking Jello, Cool Whip, and a graham cracker crust. That's all it ever was. And I would just go goo for gaga every time I came home, because it reminded me of being home. So I would say those would be like the top. But then if I had to go savory, I'm gonna really run with like coastal paella, and the venison tenderloin.
Oh, really? The venison tenderloin.
The venison tenderloin. Yeah.
All right. Well, and this kind of leads into the next question. It says, Amy and Chef Raiford, can you talk about how you work together to choose the recipes to craft this book?
Well, in our very first meeting, I said to Amy, here are all the books, the cookbooks that have just come out over the last couple of years. I don't want to be like that. I don't want this in here. I don't want to do that. I don't want any of that in there. To me, that's not even Southern. We don't even do that here in coastal Georgia. So I start off with all the things I didn't want. Then I said, but I want the categories to be based on ocean, earth, wind, fire. And then she looks at me and goes, nectar and spirits. And that was Amy. And so we decided to build the recipes around that. And so I don't think there was like, oh, this has to be the only recipe that goes into something. It was something like, oh, you're writing about wind, so tell me what wind are you going to write about? So I wrote about things that had wings. So there's, rose petal quail in there, and fried turkey, and 2-day fried chicken. So that's kind of how we thought about it, I think. Wouldn't you say that's kind of how we?
Well, there was that, yeah. We tried to balance, but also to look at what, going back to the idea of the land and the sea, we would say, okay, this is what needs to be heavier, is earth and ocean, because those were the things that you gravitated toward too. And then also a lot of it revolved around, I would just keep pestering you with questions, and I'd ask some of the same questions like 5 different ways. And we'd start getting to different family stories.
Right. Yeah.
You would talk family stories, and I'd be, okay, so what would you eat there? Or you would talk about, one of my favorite stories is Nana and her cane that's made out of the old broomstick handle.
Oh yeah.
And walking through and testing the muscadine.
Testing the muscadines, right.
The muscadine, if they don't fall, she's like, it's not ready yet, give it another week. Or she knew exactly how many days left it needed. Yeah. And then the whole story about making the wine, making the jellies, making canning and all of these things, and how you would transform the old pool table into the canning station.
True
and
story.
So, going through those stories would elicit what the recipes could be too, because then it'd say, okay, well, how would you prepare? How would you interpret that today? Or what would you make out of it today? And that was like, oh, well, you can do a compote if you don't want to do
this right here. Yeah,
jelly's more laborious. And what would you serve that with? Oh, hot griddle cakes. Okay, so we need the hot griddle cakes, and we need the, okay, what did the Aunt Florine, what did great grandmother Florine make you for breakfast? So it was like always going, we would just pester each other with questions to the point that's like, this is where the stories would come out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of recipes that didn't even make it into the book that we came up with, that we were just like, okay, we're just going to give it all to them and see what happens. And then even I remember the publisher asking us to whittle a few things down. They were like, I can't even believe you got this many recipes.
Or they'd say, that's too chefy.
Yeah. And then there were some that were too chefy, because that's just the way it's just me explaining it. So.
Well, that means you get another cookbook.
Yeah, there you go. That's what we're going to work on.
Here's a great question.
I'm so sorry to cut it. We really could I feel like we've only just brushed the surface of this great cookbook. So of course, all of our attendees need to rush and get it. And we will wait for that follow-up book with all the recipes that got left out. But we here at Politics and Prose do want to thank Matthew Raiford, Amy Paige Condon, and Dr. Jessica Harris, and our audience out there chiming in with all these amazing questions. Your patronage and dedication really enable us to bring you this type of programming. And we just couldn't do it without the book sales to support it. So hurry on over to the link in the chat to get your copy of Bress and Nyam, Gullah Geechee recipes from a 6th generation farmer, or you can visit politics-prose.com. And while you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else coming up. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, staying well-read and well-fed. And we really thank you all again. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for
Thank you all
having
so
us.
much.
Thank you, Auntie.
Take care. Be well.
Dr. Harris.
Be
Thank
well.
you.
So glad I got to meet you virtually.
Take care.
All right.